41 years. That's how long you have to wait in a government-regulated housing queue if you want to rent this 3-room apartment in the heart of Sweden's capital. What's so special about this condo? Well, it's fairly spacious, has a scenic view of the river, is a short walk from famous museums, the Swedish Parliament and the Royal Palace. However, what's really unique about it is not its enviable location, but rather a strange system it's a manifestation of. Sweden's mandatory rental waitlist program, Hyresrätt, which puts this apartment at the very top of a housing queue that has 880,000 people waiting for a chance to rent an apartment just in the Stockholm metro area. And as of August 2025, one person is still waiting since 1980. And these are official figures reported by the Stockholm Housing Agency. And this waitlist is so fundamental to Swedish life that up until 2017, before an age limit was imposed, parents enrolled their newborns on this queue so that by the time the child graduated, they would be high enough on the registry to have a shot at getting a decent place to live. Because in Sweden, it's not as simple as going online, clicking some buttons, talking to a realtor and moving in, couch first, so you can watch YouTube videos in peace. No, in Sweden, anyone who wants to legally rent an apartment has to enroll on this list and wait for their turn. And boy, do people wait. These are the typical wait times for the Stockholm County's housing queue, and what this means is even if you don't need the apartment that's on the top of this list, are willing to commute, want something cozy, and don't mind sleeping in the kitchen, you still have to wait. On average, about 11.5 years for a place you can call home. So if you live in Sweden and you are one of the lucky ones who've won this lottery and found a place to rent that's livable, you hang on to it with dear life. Because for everyone else who is waiting on the queue, the only legal alternative is subletting. Known as a second-hand contract, which is also highly regulated, costs twice as much and typically caps the rental period at about 12 months. Which means as long as you are subletting, be prepared to pack up your stuff and move almost every year. And it should come as no surprise that these apartments are so hard to find that in Sweden, most people spend half of their income on housing or end up in a sketchy neighborhood. And this data is reported by Sweden's National Board of Housing, Building and Planning. At first I found this hard to believe, but the more I researched, the more people I found who shared their horrifying experiences while dealing with housing in Sweden. While the proponents of the system argue that its upside is that if you finally win a lease called a first-hand contract for an apartment that you kinda sorta like, however long that takes, you can rent it for life. But in Sweden, this system, which was designed with good intentions, has slowly turned into a game of musical chairs, except the music never stops and almost no one gets a seat. Looking at all this, you might think that sudden mass immigration is the reason behind the housing shortage in Sweden, especially since the story has been covered widely in the media, but if you look at the data, you'll see a completely different picture, which reveals something rather unsettling, and it just might surprise you because there are 3 things that this theory fails to explain. First, take a look at this graph. This data was compiled by Statistics Sweden, a Swedish government agency responsible for producing official statistics on their population, and it clearly shows that in Sweden, population change has been constant for the last 100 years, with a short-lived immigration spike in 2016 that quickly stabilized, which again was overblown by the media. Second, and more importantly, most of the people who immigrate to new countries move to major cities because that's where the opportunities lie. But again, if you look at the official data, in Sweden there is a housing shortage in 240 out of the total 290 municipalities, even in places with little or no immigration, which directly contradicts the official narrative, and this means that the full picture is being deliberately hidden. And third, and possibly the most interesting statistic, this financial stability report by the Riksbank, the Swedish central bank, when they went back in time and pulled the data on Sweden's housing stock and mapped its availability on top of Sweden's population growth, they found that Sweden's housing and its population decoupled around 25 years ago. So something happened a long time ago that led Sweden to this impossible situation, and it's not sudden mass immigration. And that got me curious. What really happened here? And how did Sweden, which ranks near the top on education and healthcare, screw up its housing so badly and made it objectively worse, especially compared to its neighbors? Well, the strange thing is, as I kept looking, I found that this outcome is intentional. Because if we wind back the clock, there was one thing that Sweden and all its neighbors had in common: rent control. And what's interesting is that one by one, all of them abandoned this policy, but Sweden refused to do so, and got stuck in something economists call the deadweight loss triangle. It goes one step further than the supply and demand curve, but what makes this situation unique is that Sweden knew this was the case. They knew the consequences, but did everything they could to not give up rent control, which is what started this vicious cycle in the first place. You see, most of the economists agree that long-term rent control is a problem because it aims to keep the rent artificially low, but if developers can't profit from low rents, they don't build more houses, which fuels the scarcity. And in Sweden, this is a double whammy because central planning doesn't stop at rent control, as every new apartment that is built must go through strict regulations. But the data shows that in Sweden, even before a single brick is laid down, it takes years just to get a project approved. For example, if we compare it to Norway, where laws of efficiency are put in place to tackle such problems, like this one from Norway's Building Application Regulation, Chapter 7, Section 4, which says that if the municipalities exceed any approval deadlines, they will have to refund 25% of the total building application charges to the developer for each week the deadline is exceeded. And Denmark, for example, has special arbitration courts to resolve any such disputes, but in Sweden's building codes, there are no such laws that disincentivize government sluggishness, which is by design. It's not a bug. It's a feature which makes the process of building new housing unpredictable, driving up construction costs, which in Sweden, for that reason, are about 47% higher than the EU average. This makes the existing housing stock even more scarce and thus more expensive, which then needs to be tempered with rent control, causing decades-long queues. But what baffles me the most is that when the Swedish government identified this issue in the 1960s, instead of directly addressing it, they threw the kitchen sink at the problem by deciding to build 1 million houses themselves to end the shortage, and a decade later ended up with only 600,000 additional units, were unable to maintain or scale the project, and came to the rather stunning conclusion that the very obstacles that make building homes difficult for developers also, shockingly, make it difficult for the government. And even today, their outlook hasn't really changed on rent control. As more recently in 2021, when Sweden's then Prime Minister showed interest in policies which would allow market-based rents only for newly built apartments, just like Denmark did in 1992, he was ousted through a no-confidence vote, making it the first such resignation in Swedish history, resulting in a political upheaval. So, time and again, Sweden has shown that they are not just willing to give up rent control, but their government fails to come up with any other solution, or take any action. As you can see here, they constantly overlook all of the OECD's recommendations. And of course, one can make the argument that behind the scenes there are more forces at play, like a strong political lobby of tenant unions, which played a role in Sweden's PM's resignation, or mortgage interest deductibility, which adds fuel to the fire. But one thing is absolutely certain. This system, which was created with a noble vision of affordable housing for all, had exactly the opposite of its intended effect, and because of its rigid implementation and deeply flawed economics, it has created outcomes which make housing in Sweden neither affordable nor available.